This is Intercepted.
Welcome to Dropside News. I'm Murtaza Hussain. Over the past several decades, armed mercenary companies have become a major player on battlefields across the world. From the U.S. deployment of Blackwater mercenaries in Iraq and Afghanistan, to the United Arab Emirates' use of paid killers in Yemen, private military contractors specialized in dealing out violence are increasingly being employed by wealthy states as a means to augment their power. In recent years, the most powerful example of the growth of this phenomenon has been the Russian mercenary organization, the Wagner Group. Wagner fighters have deployed to conflict zones around the world, including in Syria, Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, and Ukraine. Operating with an often ambiguous relationship to the Russian government, the group has nonetheless helped secure Moscow's geopolitical and economic interests in conflict zones around the world. It has also left behind a trail of atrocities, standing accused of mass killings of civilians in Africa, as well as acts of torture and extrajudicial killings in Syria and Ukraine. Wagner is just a glimpse as to how war may be organized in a globalized future characterized by weak states and ruthless capitalism. To discuss how we arrived at this brave new world of privatized violence, we are now joined by John Lechner. John is a journalist and author of the new book, Death is Our Business: Russian Mercenaries and the New Era of Private Warfare. John, welcome to Dropsite.
Thank you for having me.
So John, before we get into discussing the Wagner Group particularly, I want to go back a little bit in the big picture. In your book, you talk about the emergence in the modern world of mercenary groups, transnational groups which engage in military operations for financial remuneration. We tend to see this as a very modern phenomenon, but as you describe, we're actually reverting back to a form of military conflict, or how military conflicts engaged in, which is actually quite pre-modern. It predates the nation state and so forth. I think a lot of us grew up envisioning armies as being things which are attached to states on a map. That's really not the norm of how they've existed in the past. Can you talk a bit about how armies emerged over time, very briefly, and then how the reemergence of mercenaries is re-straighting back to an older trend?
Sure, and thank you again for having me. Yeah, as I mentioned in the book, if we look at sort of the longue durée of history, well, first of all, mercenaries have been with us as long as we know, and it has always existed as a phenomenon. But in particular, as you mentioned, for much of history, especially in Europe during the Middle Ages, in the early modern era, mercenary armies were essentially the norm. And if rulers were looking to fight it out over land or resources, they could go to a series of mercenary brokers who would help them raise an army. And if you had the funds, you could go to war. This started to change with the development of the nation state as rulers with access to both capital and also agricultural rural areas were able to raise public standing armies and gradually take over a lot of these kind of small duchies and other kind of nation state entities that existed in the 16th and 17th century. But the practice of mercenarism, even though the nation states in Europe themselves were slowly, accidentally, effectively kind of becoming public armies, those types of companies were still used. They were mostly used, though, as European states pursued colonial ambitions abroad. And so you saw the rise of companies like the British East India Company. The French conquest of Africa was very often done by sort of these adventurers, volunteers, companies that raise capital and go and conquer on behalf of the state. And so those public-private partnerships have existed for a long time. And where we are now is we're seeing a rise of kind of a modern form of mercenarism, especially in the private military company, which has come about following would say, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War.
I remember during the Iraq War, obviously for people who are of the age, they remember what was going on at that time. There was a very famous company which was introduced, or infamous, you could say it later on, introduced to the U.S. operations in Iraq, which was known at the time as Blackwater, and headed by Eric Prince. And this was the first entree, I think, of many people to the idea of private military contractors in warfare. And obviously, it never stopped existing. It always continued existing, and there were very famous PMCs, as they're called, like executive outcomes of South African military veterans and so forth, who engaged in operations for money and so forth. But Blackwater became quite famous during the Iraq War because, first of all, the U.S. had entailed their services, they had hired their services in the war. And secondly, they were also involved in some human rights abuses and massacres in Iraq, which became, they gained quite great notoriety for. Can you talk a bit about Blackwater and the emergence of mercenarism gradually in the post 9/11 era, and what economic factors were helping bring that about or make that seem a attractive option for states like the United States?
Yeah, I think it's both a supply and a demand question, right? You have, I mean, particularly during the War on Terror, we saw kind of what I would call as sort of the culmination at that time of what a lot of folks would refer to as sort of the Washington Consensus, right? Which is an emphasis on privatization of what would typically be sort of the purview of the government, and looking towards markets as sort of the efficient, rational means to achieve outcomes. And so under the Bush administration and then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in particular, we saw this drive in the War on Terror too. And Rumsfeld has a great quote in my book where he talks about how, we should be working as essentially a venture capital firm in terms of how we're prosecuting this warfare. And so this was a boon for private contractors to enter the market and offer their services. And of course, on their end too, guys like Eric Prince were particularly adept at positioning themselves to the U.S. government and their services as essentially furthering America's interests in the war on terror as well. But I think one of the most important aspects or reasons why contractors were so useful during the war on terror, I think the most important reason is that they effectively made it possible to prosecute very significant wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, two wars in two different countries without having to resort to a military draft, which these types of wars in the past would have entailed.
It's an interesting point you raised because obviously a draft is something which is very politically explosive in countries where it's brought about. And as unpopular as the Iraq War was, if there'd been a draft, on top of that, I'm sure people would have been, the opposition would have been even more strident. And in some countries, it could be politically dangerous for leaders to entail a draft. So mercenaries are an attractive option. So now, I want to get more directly to, the subject of your book, more very specifically, which is the Wagner Group. Now, obviously, at the end of the Soviet Union, there was this collapse of this gigantic empire, which was at conflict with the United States for many, many decades. By far, either the preeminent or the second most powerful military power in the world. When that edifice collapsed, you had all these guys who had military training, many of them were out of a job. They had global connections. They had access to advanced equipment in some cases. And, there was a lot of fear at the time. If you read and look back at the U.S. and global statements about what could happen out of the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, all these things, but also just these personnel, what they might get up to after the Soviet Union collapsed. And out of the emergence of that, we've seen some of these non-state actor groups gradually coalesce. And the most famous of them right now is Wagner. And for Wagner, and as mentioned in the introduction to the show, it's a transnational, you could say mercenary group or private military contractor, which is connected to the Russian government and acts for the Russian government indirectly in foreign conflicts around the world. John, can you tell me a bit about how Wagner came about and what were the origins of this very, very famous and very, very consequential at the moment mercenary organization?
As you mentioned, kind of the supply side of people who would constitute sort of the personnel of a private military company is solved in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so, Russia, like other big states, always has a surplus, a large amount of, in this case, particularly men who have experience in the Russian military and get out, and a percentage of them, for whatever reason, whether it be kind of wanting that camaraderie that comes with service, the boredom that comes with kind of being just a security guard in the local mall, or, for some businessman, and the adventure of going abroad, and the money is particularly attractive. But there have the development of kind of Russia's private military companies first came about in the kind of early 2000s to around the kind of the 2010s, and mercenarism itself is illegal in Russia. And so these first companies sort of got started by sort of skirting the law and essentially kind of headquartering themselves in another country, or in Hong Kong, or someplace in the Bahamas or something. And they would usually do sort of the types of work that other PMCs like Blackwater or Western firms would do, protecting convoys. A number of them actually worked in Iraq during the War on Terror, and particularly during the Somali piracy crisis, protecting ships in the Gulf of Aden. These kind of entities sort of existed, not quite legal, but also kind of no one pays that much attention to it, and so really where we start to see them kind of come together in a more meaningful way is during the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine in late 2013, early 2014, where in reaction to it, the Kremlin makes the decision to annex Crimea, and to do so, they rely on special forces, but also sort of these local volunteers and Russian nationalist and patriotic organizations like the Cossacks, who come over and provide sort of this local security around the referendum. When the annexation is successful, the Kremlin thinks it's done and dusted, and everyone can go home. But it causes a series of events in eastern Ukraine where pro-Russian separatists are looking for the state support as well, and the Kremlin is put in a difficult place. They don't want to annex eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region, and risk further sanctions. And so they turn to these kind of mercenaries as a sort of shadowy, covert way to support the rebels without really supporting them.
John, can you tell us a bit about the origins of Wagner, and particularly the person of Evgeny Prigozhin? Now, Prigozhin, for people who don't know, he was the head of the Wagner group. He was a very iconic figure globally and also within the organization and within Russia. First, he launched what seemed to be an aborted coup against the Kremlin during the Ukraine war, and then he was killed when his airplane was shot down shortly thereafter. Can you talk a bit, John, about who Prigozhin was and what role he had in becoming, from what we know, seems to be a caterer or a chef, into becoming the head of this very, very big and very, very sprawling and very ruthless mercenary organization?
Sure. I think Prigozhin kind of becomes, obviously, one of the central characters in the book. He is indeed a founder, along with Dmitry Utkin, the former Russian intelligence official who sort of runs the military side of the operations. But Prigozhin himself is such a fascinating, and he becomes an almost kind of Shakespearean character in the end. But he grew up on kind of the equivalent of the wrong side of the tracks in the Soviet Union. He was kind of a street thug, a petty thief. He goes away to prison for 8 or 9 years for assault and robbery. And when he gets out, the Soviet Union is collapsing around him, and he returns to his native Leningrad, what is now St. Petersburg, and with the help of some local gangsters, falls in with running sort of a grocery store chain, and then eventually opening up 2 restaurants that very much cater to the nouveau riche in the Russian elite. And it's there that he meets a younger Vladimir Putin, and he leverages that relationship too to eventually providing meals to the Russian military and the Russian schools. And so essentially he becomes a big-time contractor for the Russian military. And this eventually puts him in a position to move more than just meals, but men as well.
Yeah, it's very fascinating because, out of the wreckage of the Soviet Union, you had all these guys you mentioned, like Prigozhin, who were kind of, rough and tumble kind of guys. And there was this sort of, you could say, Wild West environment they created in Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a lot of criminality, there was mafias, there was not very much law. And in a way, the emergence of Putin as a dictator in Russia, in a way, put an end to some of the chaos, but it also institutionalized a lot of the criminality in what we see, in the manifestations of Wagner and these organizations now. So, as you mentioned, Wagner is operative. It started in Ukraine. It was operative there. It took part in the original invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and has continued to take part in it in various ways. What is the global footprint of Wagner at the moment? In your book, you talk about Africa, Middle East, continued involvement in Eastern Europe. Where is Wagner right now, and what is it doing?
Well, I think first, maybe it's worth just mentioning to listeners just kind of a quick timeline that kind of where they were and to get a sense of where they are now, because they've left a number of the places that they've actually intervened in. But like you mentioned, they were very active in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. They then lobbied and got thrown out multiple times, and then lobbied to come back into to participate in Russia's overt intervention in Syria that began in late 2015. And then Prigozhin and his team really start very often themselves going out and looking for business throughout Africa. I mean, this is a place where you had mentioned, I think, executive outcomes earlier. This is a place where other PMCs are operating and marketing their services, and it's no surprise that Prigozhin's team would do the same. And so they land deals in Sudan, the Central African Republic. Wagner then participates in General Khalifa Haftar's attempt to take Tripoli in Libya. They intervene as well in Mali's conflict in the Sahel, in addition to a number of kind of smaller interventions in places like Madagascar and Mozambique, before eventually, as you mentioned, joining Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that started in February 2022. Now, kind of after the mutiny, there's a whole process whereby the Ministry of Defense and the Russian state are looking to fully take over Wagner's operations. And so where we tend to see the remnants of it are in the Central African Republic and partially in Mali as well. And a number of the guys who worked for Wagner, of course, are now just working for other entities like Africa Corps in Libya, or, until quite recently in Syria as well, where local events kind of took over in December.
Yeah, personally, I was aware of Wagner for some years before, but the incident that really galvanized my attention and many others actually was in Syria. It was the execution of a Syrian army defector by a group of Wagner fighters. They videotaped the execution, and it was done with a sledgehammer. And the sledgehammer became like a symbol of Wagner thereafter. And I believe the family members of the individual who were killed tried to launch I think they're still trying to pursue a global lawsuit against the organization over what happened. It's kind of unclear how it can proceed because of the legally murky atmosphere in which Wagner operates. But yeah, it was a very iconic, you could say, incident in the growth of Wagner and global public consciousness. Can you talk a bit about how Wagner has adapted now because obviously there are these significant changes going on in the relationship between the U.S. and the West, with Russia and the West, and particularly in the Ukraine war. So, Wagner took part in the 2014 invasion of Crimea. What role have they played in the current war, currently ongoing there at the moment? And I wanted to also get your take on the issue of prisoners who have fought for Wagner inside Ukraine.
Well, I mean, Ukraine is ultimately also the area that eventually would pit Prigozhin against the Russian state and the Ministry of Defense itself. So, again, we talked a little bit about Prigozhin's character. I think what becomes clear to the reader in the book is that he himself has just an incredible level of ambition, narcissism. He is very confident in his own abilities, but he also rubs a lot of people the wrong way within Putin's inner circle and the Ministry of Defense. And initially during Russia's full-scale invasion, the Ministry of Defense Minister Shoigu, wanted to keep Prigozhin out of it. They thought this would be a relatively quick operation, that the Ukrainians would welcome the Russians with open arms, and there was no need for guys who are very often a thorn in their side. And that obviously very quickly turned out not to be the case, and Wagner and its ability to recruit men to the front and the talent of many of its commanders who, even if they kind of weren't, Russian special forces, had far more experience in battle in the intervening years than most Russian soldiers, had to be brought to bear. And Prigozhin gets into the conflict about a month after the full-scale invasion. And he decides he's going to overcome all of his rivals by just delivering these victories to the Kremlin. And so he gets a few early ones, and then he gets the exclusive permission to go to Russia's prison system and recruit convicts. And he travels across the country and makes an offer to Russia's prisoners that if they fight for him for 6 months and they survive, they will be free men with their criminal record expunged. And about 50,000 Russian convicts sign up to effectively be kind of human waves for his wild attempt to take the city of Bakhmut from Ukrainian forces. And essentially, these convicts are jumping out of the trenches and trying to make it to the Ukrainian side, and about 50% of them were killed in these, what was called kind of the Bakhmut meat grinder. But ultimately, it's an inefficient but effective way to fight.
I'm sure you've done this, but if you talk to Ukrainian veterans of that battle who witnessed what happened, it was very shocking because, as you mentioned, it was like a meat grinder in the sense it was almost reminiscent of, World War I or Iran-Iraq war, human wave attacks, which have not been seen in some decades in a major conflict. And despite, I guess, taking tremendous casualties, the Russians have been making progress in Ukraine and ostensibly relying on disposable sort of troops like you see in Wagner and maybe North Koreans and so forth they've been sending to conflict. It's a very, very shocking sort of tactic they've been employing to, to some effect we've seen at the moment. So, John, I wanted to ask also, and we've talked about this a little bit, there are reasons which states, including Russia, would like to use organizations like Wagner. They're a way of keeping the public insulated from political pressures like a draft. They're also a means of having plausible deniability, I think, in their foreign policy. There are other states, in the Middle East who deploy proxy groups, sometimes the jihadist groups and these other sort of irregular militias in foreign conflicts to pursue their interest. It seems like Wagner, in a way, is an analogy to that in the sense that it's being deployed in various theaters where Russia has economic interests or political interests, and it's not necessarily directly associated with Russia. There's a patina of it being a private enterprise, at least to some degree, but it acts to further the influence of the Russian government in these areas. Can you talk a bit about why Wagner would be in Central African Republic, for instance, or why it was in Syria for that long, and what relationship this had between the organization and the Russian government?
I think, what I really tried to do with this book, or the way that I felt I had to write it was to set out and get interviews within Wagner itself. And so this is a very kind of character-driven book that's based on a lot of interviews with probably about like 40 guys or so who were either Wagner mercenaries or executives in some way. And I think what is interesting, therefore, about the book is that you get a little bit of a bottom-up perspective on how politics are made. And what you find is that in a place like the Central African Republic, which is very near and dear to my heart, I've spent a long time traveling throughout it, meeting lots of folks. It is still, unfortunately, it is the poorest and the least developed country in the world. It is not important to any major state. It's not important to the United States. It's not important to France. It's also not important to Russia. What such an area is therefore kind of it's particularly fruitful to study, because you can find the ways in which what I would call these security entrepreneurs, guys like Evgeny Prigozhin, are able to sort of try to create what Russia's interests in these countries should be. And so when Prigozhin showed up, there wasn't there wasn't a footprint of the Russian state. And so he had a lot of leeway to go out and try to expand into all sorts of businesses that he could. And he was selling that intervention back to the Kremlin as through the narrative of returning Russia to Africa and bolstering Russia's great power status, when in reality, Russia really didn't have any reason to be in the Central African Republic in the same way that the United States really doesn't, and France really doesn't either.
You know what's funny? If you look at the Soviet Union, it had a very internationalist sort of discourse.
Yeah.
And obviously, when it collapsed, it was replaced by a nation state, Russia, and it still had an amalgam of different peoples, but it was much more less globally expansive in identity than you could say the Soviet Union aspired to be. When I look at the Wagner, propaganda or just their communications and in their activities, it seems almost like there's an echo of like a twisted sort of version of the Soviet idea in their internationalism, because they have the Africa Corps, as you mentioned. They have significant activities in North Africa. They had in the Middle East as well too, and they seem to operate in the sense that the world is our area of influence. And if it's not asking why we're there, of course we're there. We're there because obviously there's something we have to say there, and maybe there's economic interest for us, and we have a global mission to combat X, Y, and Z. Of course, in the case of Wagner, it's directly mercenary. They're trying to make money, and they're working, being hired for governments. But there's some sort of the resonance of Soviet internationalism in some sort of corrupted way seems to be evident somewhere in Wagner. I guess people who grew up in the Soviet Union.
I think if you talk to them as well, it's not. I think there's so much focus in the West. With any kind of geopolitical other, which Russia clearly is to the West right now, there's a tendency to try and figure out or to categorize these things in like specific binaries. Like, what is Wagner? Is it the Russian state, or is it like an independent PMC? The answer is both. Like, are they interested in money or like patriotism? And the answer is both, because as individuals, our ability to rationalize whatever we do is essentially limitless. And so, I'm here in Washington, D.C. I live in the capital of public-private partnerships, where defense companies are absolutely profit-driven and yet frame everything that they do as furthering American defense and these social goods. Most mercenaries are not classically independent mercenaries who will fight for whichever side will pay them the most. They tend to come out of the militaries in which they served. They tend to be, conservative. They tend to be patriotic. And it wasn't counterintuitive to any of these guys that they were both making money and were Russian patriots furthering the interests of the Russian state in where they were trying to be. That was the best way that they could both view themselves and their business in order to profit from the Russian state as well.
Yeah, that's very well said. And you see there's a strong Russian nationalist patriotism in their culture. And you've seen that very clearly.
Yeah. I mean, and sometimes going over into, like neo-Nazi type stuff too. Right.
So, John, I want to ask you, looking at this in a larger perspective, obviously you've been covering Wagner for some time, and you've also written about how they fit in to this broader evolution of, you could say, capitalism in the last 20, 30 years in the post-Cold War. How do you see this phenomenon of PMCs evolving? Because obviously, I think that there are other countries which are likely to look at Wagner and look at this model and see aspects of it which are attractive. Given economic trends and political trends in the world, do you foresee more PMCs like Wagner coming about in the future? And if so, how might they look?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the direction in which it's going. I think you mentioned executive outcomes in the 90s, and that was really kind of a classic independent PMC. A lot of those guys were coming out of the apartheid government. They didn't have the backing of the new South African state, and they sold their services to other governments and provided the kit and everything that was needed. The Blackwaters of the world made their money by primarily focusing on just embedding as much as they could within America's national security infrastructure as a way to get more and more contracts, right? So Blackwater's primary client was the U.S. government. Wagner represented sort of a mix between these two, and also, unlike Blackwater, Wagner would go out on offensive operations. They've created, I think, a market for their services, and so it's sort of inevitable that other security entrepreneurs are going to look to emulate the product that Wagner was offering. You see it. Turkey is increasingly involved in this space. There's a great section in my book in Libya where Sadat is recruiting Syrians to the conflict. The Turkish PMC is recruiting Syrians to one side of the conflict, while Wagner is recruiting Syrians to the other side. The UAE works quite a bit with PMCs and various militias across the Middle East and Africa. Rwanda functions very much like a PMC in a lot of ways, with a similar economic model to Wagner's. And so this is certainly and now even you look with the Trump administration and the calls for using PMCs to go after cartels in Mexico, policing the border. So I think that the trend is heading further into that direction.
Yeah, and to your point, just to briefly wrap up for listeners who may not know, Eric Prince, the Blackwater founder, recently offered the U.S. government to fight the Houthi group in Yemen, who have been attacking shipping in Yemen and launching ballistic missiles at Israel in the context of the current war. He offered to create a private military enterprise to attack them because of the evident failings of the current coalition approach to suppressing the Houthis. So it seems like a brave new world which we're all entering in. And John, thank you so much for doing so much to document the first, and not the first, but the most prominent current manifestation of the mercenary phenomenon, which is likely to grow in the years to come. John Lechner, thank you so much for joining us. Please all check out his book, and we'd love to have you back on in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was John Lechner. His new book, Death is Our Business, Russian Mercenaries and the New Era of Private Warfare, is out now. And that does it for this episode. Make sure to follow us on our new podcast feed by searching for Dropside News wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please do leave us a rating or review. It helps other listeners to find us as well. Our show today was produced by Jose Olivares. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe to dropsidenews.com. If you have the funds to do so, please become a paid subscriber. All our content is free for anyone, but our paid subscribers are the fuel that keeps our engine running. Make sure to follow us on all social media platforms, and please do share our work. This program was made possible in part by a grant from The Intercept. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Murtaza Hussain.